Please keep in mind that the views expressed by our speakers do not necessarily represent those of the Areopagus or our host church. With that, I'd like to just briefly introduce our two guests this evening, and then I'll turn it over to them. First of all, Dr. Melvyn Fein. Dr. Fein is a professor of sociology at Kennesaw State University. He received his PhD in sociology from the City University of New York. And the first half of his career, he worked as a clinical sociologist, providing therapeutic services to clients in such diverse venues as a psychiatric hospital and a community mental health center, which I think makes him eminently qualified to speak to a church audience. Dr. Fein was also involved in private practice in his early career. In the second half of his career, he specialized in social theory, especially as it applies to social change. He's former president of the Georgia Sociological Association, and he's currently the editor of the Journal of Public and Professional Sociology. He's the author of numerous books, several of which we have again featured there on the back table. And Dr. Fein also writes a weekly column in the Marietta Journal, which is, my wife and I live in Marietta, and this is where I first became aware of Dr. Fein and the very impressive editorials that he writes on a regular basis. Dr. Richard Howe, many of you are familiar with Dr. Howe. Dr. Howe is a writer as well as a public speaker and debater in churches and conferences and university campuses on issues related to Christian apologetics and philosophy. Dr. Howe is a professor emeritus of philosophy and apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, where he still teaches part-time, and he's spoken on several occasions at our Areopagus forums in the past. He has a BA from Mississippi College, an MA in philosophy from the University of Mississippi, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Arkansas. Both his master's thesis and his doctoral dissertation focused on the issue of the existence of God. His doctoral dissertation is titled The Defense of Thomas Aquinas' Second Way, in which he defends Thomas Aquinas' efficient causality argument for the existence of God, the second of Aquinas' famous 5 ways. Dr. Howe is a contributor to several books, including the popular Encyclopedia of Apologetics, Reasons for Faith, and a forthcoming tribute in honor of one of his foremost mentors, the Christian philosopher Norman Geisler. He's also had articles published in Christian Apologetics Journal, the Areopagus Journal, and the Christian Research Journal. And in his free time, Richard and his wife, Rebecca, enjoy international travel. So it's quite a joy and a privilege to have with us this evening, as I said, 2 top-notch scholars. And the formatting this evening, each of our speakers is going to take about 15 minutes to talk a bit about his life and formation of his core values and so on. Then there will be a period of discussion and Q&A between the 2 of them, and then we'll open it up for Q&A with the audience as well. So without further ado, I'd like to call Dr. Fein up. Again, if you will, please extend a very warm welcome.
Thank you, folks. I'm pleased to be here. We'll see whether you're pleased what I get done. Now, let me give you something of my background. I am not a Christian. I've never been a Christian. I grew up Jewish in New York City. Until I was about 11 years old and I was studying for my bar mitzvah, I thought I might become a rabbi. But by the time I had my bar mitzvah, I was already an atheist. Ultimately, when I started college, I majored in philosophy, which meant that I studied about religion and the theories of God, etc., etc. At about that time, I was extraordinarily left-wing in my views. Socialist, not just liberal. I had the good fortune to have 2 close friends who changed their major from philosophy to economics, and in the process became conservative. We roomed together for about a year, and we argued incessantly until 6 o'clock in the morning, night after night. Them from the conservative point of view, me from the socialist point of view, and I gave not an inch. Nevertheless, it got me thinking. And one of my friends ultimately went on to get his PhD at the University of Chicago, where he studied with Milton Friedman. And I had the opportunity to sit in classes by Milton Friedman. Got to thinking. But it took me about a decade before I changed my position. Now, initially, I went to graduate school in philosophy, but I dropped out, partly because I became very dissatisfied with philosophy. There were no answers. There were lots of positions, and no way to decide between them. What worked in Brooklyn College did not work in Wisconsin. And it was like, where was I supposed to turn? I came back to New York City. I had no idea what to do with my life. I had left school. I went into the army. I came back. I got into a relationship. It absolutely fell apart. I got into jobs I loathed and despised. I did not know where to turn. I went to the man I considered my mentor at Brooklyn College, one of the sanest people I knew, and he said, you know, when I was your age, I went into psychotherapy, and it really helped me. And this was a shock. Until then, I believed my father. His attitude was, the only people who went to therapy are crazy people. I wasn't going to give them satisfaction. But I went into therapy and stayed there for 6 years, and it changed my point of view on myself and on life. And during that period, I really did all kinds of things. I was a cab driver, a newspaper reporter, a market researcher. I worked for the Off-Trend Petting Corporation. I did all kinds of stuff to learn about life and to learn about myself. Ultimately, I went back to university and got my doctorate in sociology. I'm not quite sure the direction I was going to go, but I was interested in things having to do with mental health, and so I eventually wound up working at a psychiatric hospital, etc., etc. And during the process, I applied what I'd learned in sociology to what I was doing to help people, and came up with what is essentially a sociological understanding of what psychotherapy is about. And I began to write about that, and when I did, that's when I switched over and became an academic. Now, when I came here to Georgia, and I came here not because I loved Georgia, I do now, but I came here because they offered me a job. And I thought I was going to be establishing a department of clinical sociology until I discovered that the dean would allow no such thing. And so, by then I had written my first book or so. I was finishing a book on anger management. The reason I was doing the anger management is I grew up with a very angry father, and I was dealing with my own feelings of anger as well. And it was a way of trying to understand and come to terms with things. And then I moved on to writing about morality and the sociology of morality. Now, let me explain. When I was young, I was interested in being a rabbi. I was deeply interested in right and wrong. My family was interested in right and wrong. But the question was, well, I now call it my tripartite theory of morality, to the effect that morality consists of, one, informal rules that are paradigmatically learned. Two, that when it is changed, and I believe that it is changed through polarized social negotiations that often become extreme. And three, that it is largely enforced through intense emotions like anger and guilt and shame. Okay? And so I try to understand what happens and why we're in the fights and how the fights are resolved, that sort of thing. Since then, I have moved on to deal with other related issues. Usually, I am trying to resolve the problems that came from my own childhood and my own experience. I have always wanted to understand what is going on. Now, mind you, I'm a human being. It means I have limitations. which means there are plenty of things I don't understand in this world. I never will. But I keep trying to push the frontier out to understand more and more. And so I studied things like human hierarchies. You know, I'm an academic. And as an academic, you're surrounded by their growth. And these are folks who want everything to be equal. And studying hierarchies, I came to the conclusion that no, that is not going to happen. We're a hierarchical species. It's not created by rich people who force it on everyone else. It comes from us and what we are as human beings. As I often ask my students, how many of you want to be losers? I've been teaching, for 2.5 decades. I haven't had a single student who wanted to be a loser. I tell them I'll make it easy. I'll give them a failure. All they have to do is ask for it. They never do. And so I've looked at it and tried to understand the mechanisms that create our hierarchies and why they go in particular directions and not other directions. And then in dealing with this, I moved on to studying the middle class. And I believe we are a middle class society, the first middle class society in the history of the world. In other words, we're pioneers. We're breaking new ground no one has ever traversed before. And therefore we don't always know where we're going or what's happening to us. And so I've been trying to understand what is happening. I, by the way, am a big fan of the middle class. The rich folks still have more power than the middle class, but the middle class sets the standards. An example would be Prince Charles in England, His great-grandfather was able to have a mistress and nobody cared. He tries that and he gets in trouble because the middle class doesn't like it. All right? So I have come to the conclusion that we are moving toward a society that is becoming more and more professionalized. What do I mean by professionalized? I mean more and more jobs are complicated and require discretion. And the people who occupy them, like doctors and lawyers and college professors, have to be self-motivated experts in what they do. They have to be good at it, and they have to do it well because they care, not because somebody's telling them to. In other words, you can delegate these people responsibility because they are responsible and competent. I think that's where we're going. I had a book published last spring called The Self-Directed University, which explains how I think universities need to be oriented to creating this kind of professionalized skill and attitude. All right. But then the question is, are these things going to happen, or what's going to happen at all? And I have learned, despite my ambitions of sailing the world when I was a young man, you grow up, you grow a little older. I thought you get older and you just become cynical and whatnot, but I'm not sure that's true. I thought my father was embittered. I don't think I'm embittered at all. I think I've become realistic and I realize that there are absolutely limitations on what it is possible to do in this world. Not that you can do nothing, not that there's nothing you can do. There is plenty you can do as long as you understand that there are parameters. So, my latest book, I'm working on it right now, is called Evolution versus Revolution, Paradoxes of Social Change. They have come to the conclusion that the folks on the left wing, which includes the liberals, but especially the Marxists, who want to change the world. Isn't that what Obama told us he wanted? He wanted to change the world, change the United States. That what they say they want isn't going to happen. They say they will change, but mostly they're trying to get rid of what is they have no idea of what is to come or what will be later. I'm not sure anybody does. I know a lot of religious folks believe they do. And I've got to say that I agree with the religious folks about a lot of central values. Like honesty and responsibility and family and fairness. I absolutely believe in those things too. But they're not enough. They're not enough to guide us into the future, into a professionalized future. Because it's too complicated. There's so much we don't understand. So many things that are happening that we don't know and we don't predict. Who predicted that we would have this glut of unwed motherhood? I don't know anybody who predicted that. Who predicted that half of Americans would cohabit before they married? I don't know anyone who predicted that. Who thought that the average age at which women would marry would be 27 and the average age of men would be 29? When I was a kid, it was, 18, a woman gets married, 21, a man gets married. As I look at this stuff and I say, how does this happen? How does this accumulate? How do we help to make it move in directions that are beneficial when obviously so many of the people who are trying to change our world don't know what they're doing, are dishonest, mean-spirited, and just treacherous. Okay? So, I like religious people. I'm not one. Understand that. I'm not one. But I appreciate people who are looking for the right answers and who are trying to do the good thing. I don't think that the spirituality is going to be the answer to our question. I don't think it's not the answer for some people. I mean, I'm not one of these people who wants to get rid of spirituality. I don't know whether you're right or wrong. I'm an agnostic. I don't know, and so who am I to tell people what to do? Okay? But I would like more and more people to fight for a professionalized world in which we do protect one another. And I'm just telling, by the way, I'm not a feminist, I'm an anti-feminist. And I was telling my class, the reason I am is because I believe in the children. I believe in protecting the children. They don't ask to come into this world. They're not equipped to protect themselves. If we don't protect the world that they come into and their futures, they won't have a future. So that's where I am right now, looking for ways to push things forward in directions that I think will be beneficial to folks in general. Okay?
Extend a warm welcome to Dr. Howe.
Well, I often grace people with using a PowerPoint so they don't just stare at me as much as they might otherwise have to if they didn't have that. So if you'll allow me the crutch of being able to use that to help you along. I want to try to cover a lot of material in my 15 minutes. Now, Dr. Fein made a comment, observation about equality, that equality is something that we cannot achieve. I think equality is something we can achieve, it's just more than others. Amen. That's the key to the whole thing. But I want to set a context for the question that's before us, because that question has to do with, which we'll get into, I think, in the Q&A a little bit more pointedly, do we need God to be good? And I'm going to tell you what I think is the answer to that question here in due course. But let me set a context so that you'll know where I'm coming from and how I answer this question. I was born at a very young age, as a lot of people are these days. And I was reared in a very loving, stable, middle-class family in the Deep South, and that's me right there. It's nodding his head. So you don't know which of the two I'm going to there. I went off to college, community college. We called it junior college back then. I used to tell people when they would see this picture of me then, or this one here, that I looked like an ugly girl. That's what it looked like. I actually didn't know my hair was long back then. I thought it was. But the salient event that happened to me in college is having left community college studying music, is I went off to senior college and lost my faith. I had become a Christian at 16 through the influence of other friends of mine at high school. Wasn't raised in the church or anything like that, even though it was a loving home. It wasn't a church home. Went off to college, but was confronted with ideas that I'd never really anticipated, and subsequently lost my faith while I was in college. That's just indicates here. That was sort of the direction I was looking for in my life. So, Dr. Bashir has already mentioned one of three really important influences in my life during this time of what St. John of the Cross calls the dark night of the soul. There's Norm Geisler, Josh McDowell, and R.C. Sproul, probably three of the most significant public figures in philosophy and apologetics who heavily influenced my thinking. So to make a short story long, I went to seminary, left seminary, went back to the university, eventually got my doctorate in philosophy. The reason I did philosophy primarily was because my interests were in Christian apologetics. Having lost my faith as a Christian, came back to faith primarily through the apologetic ministry of the three like I just mentioned. But at that time, you couldn't just run off to seminary and study apologetics. There really wasn't such thing in the 80s. So at the counsel of Norm Geisler, he said, you ought to go back to the University of Philosophy. That's what I did. Now, just to dispel a couple of myths, the earlier picture you saw with me with a guitar, I'm actually a drummer. That's actually what I studied in music. I was called percussion, I think was the drummer word. Where I ran around, it was just called a drummer. So I'm actually a drummer more than a guitarist. But one other myth that always follows me no matter where I go has to do with this sort of similarity that you may or may not just say. Okay? We'll just leave it at that. You've never seen me and Anton LaVey in the same room at the same time. That's, like Clark Kent Superman. So if you'll allow me just a quick second of self-promotion, as if I were talking about myself for 15 minutes wasn't enough. I will invite you to go to my website, richardghowe.com, and the slides here and some other things are in a PDF deck. So if you go follow the links to the materials, click on PDF deck, scroll down, you'll find the God and Morality PDF, and you can download a PDF of the slides that you're going to see here as we move through. So the question assigned to us then, primarily, is does morality need God? Can we be good without God? To me, that asks a lot of other questions, all of which you could spend an entire evening, in fact, like an entire book on. That are nested questions. Question like, does God exist? And then things like, is God necessary for morality, which is a subtitle for tonight's talk. Has God revealed additional truths to us beyond those discoverable by natural reason? That presents itself. What is it to be good? Because we're already perhaps assuming that we understand what we think when we say, well, we need God to be good. We're working with some kind of, at least a minimal understanding of what it means to be good. Is there such thing as sin? Religious people very often think that there is a such thing as sin. If that's true, then how and to what extent, if any, does sin affect our ability to rightly understand the good, whatever that is? Is that relevant as we conscientiously try to ferret out our understanding of these things? Does sin figure into this at all? Is it a reality that does to any extent affect us? Further, how and to what extent, if any, does sin affect our ability to seek the good, even if we could understand it, which I think we can? That doesn't entail that we necessarily are able to achieve it to even an appreciable degree. So at least the question merits examination. Obviously, we're not going to be able to settle all this tonight. And in a way, I'm bringing these up as a way of preempting some of the rabbit trails we could follow. And they're only rabbit trails because of the constraints of time. If we had the luxury of time, they would indeed, I think, be very fruitful rabbit trails, so to speak, to follow. But it's all a way of saying we're not going to be able to perhaps answer all of these questions to all of our satisfaction. Now, so we have to try to disentangle these. And I'm not suggesting I'm any better at this than anybody else as far as, well, gee, as soon as you start talking about this, that's connected to what we already said here about that, and all of a sudden we're back into this question we thought we weren't going to talk about earlier. There's no way to avoid that, I think, but we'll try our best as we go through in our minutes together. But let me just see if I can set a tone of what I think is going on with this issue. I take a cue from Aristotle, who says our discussion will be adequate if it is as much clearness as the subject matter admits of, for precision is not to be sought for alike in all discussions. For it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. It is evidently equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician than to demand from a rhetorician scientific proofs. And so he wrote this at the very close to the beginning of his Nicomachean Ethics, the most important treatise on ethics, because he realized that discussions about ethics can quickly get foggy, and there are going to be areas of disagreement, and I think that's certainly the case. And I don't think that Dr. Fein would disagree with that. He says something very similar in his Hardball Without an Umpire. In truth, moral rules are not formal rules, they are informal and are inherently imprecise and ambiguous. Their nature is such that they are always subject to dispute and reinterpretation. In any given case, people can be and often are puzzled about what they signify. I think that's exactly right. But we must not let, I think he would agree with this as well, we must not let the specter of confused and talk and confused ideas to intimidate us from at least trying. Let me start. You guys can talk awkwardly on each other. Is my mic on? Hi, my name is Richard Howe. I was born at a very young age. Sorry, that was probably totally my fault. All right, so now I thought of a metaphor to try to understand the difference as I see it between. Are you misbehaving behind me?
I just thought that was so brilliant.
It's like, who in the world said that? How I understand, now I'm a philosopher by training. Here's how I understand in some of these questions what the role of a philosopher is. And it's the difference, at least for my purposes, between engineering and reverse engineering. Okay, so by and large, an engineer is going to see a problem, and he will seek to solve that problem by bringing to bear on the problem the resources and talents and whatever to solve the problem. He applies the resources, and hopefully if he's worked everything right, then voila, the problem is solved. Now, a reverse engineer, however, doesn't try to solve a problem unless you just want to characterize the question he's asking himself as a problem. But what I mean is, he starts with a solution, and then he tries to reverse engineer of how does that solution, which I already know is there, I already agree with the solution, but I'm not so sure I understand exactly why it is that is the solution. And so the reverse engineer goes backwards from a solution back to how it works. The analogy is that a lot of contemporary philosophy acts like an engineer. And so it thinks it can suspend judgment about whether we have solutions. Do we have knowledge? Is there such thing as morality? And such. And then they try their best to bring all their resources to bear to solve these problems. Whereas the classical tradition, of which I would consider myself a proponent, Aristotle up through the Middle Ages to Thomas Aquinas, doesn't ask questions like, well, do we have knowledge? It's like, well, yeah, we've got knowledge. I know you're asking me, do we have knowledge? I know that. So it's not the question of do we have knowledge, it's not the question necessarily, is there such thing as good? It's a matter of, given that those things are real, and I'm more sure of them than I am of a lot of things, how can I reverse engineer to try to figure out under the hood what's actually going on here? So where does that bring us to this question as far as do we need God to be good? Let me, just so you'll know where I'm coming from at the very beginning, let me give you, I think, the unequivocal answer to the question, do we need God to be good, is absolutely yes and no. Okay, I think it's absolutely yes and no. Now, what do I mean by that? That sounds like something a philosopher would want to try to trick everybody with. And I'm not trying to get lost in the fog. say, well, you can't disagree with me because after all, you're not really quite sure what I mean. So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm not, and then I'm gone after it's all over. What I mean is that I think the answer to, do we need God to be good, is ultimately yes, but proximately no. And the reason this means a lot to me is because I think, I'm also, another thing that influenced me heavily in my life was the moral majority and the religious roundtable and Ed McAteer and the Reagan Revolution and all that. And I think a lot of us as Christians were, it's not their fault, but I made this mistake, I think, is that we thought what we were obligated to do is to try to convince everybody around us of the truth of the Christian faith, and then once we did that, then our society would right itself morally. And I think that's not the way God superintends the affairs of human beings. I think that good is something that's real, that we can know is real, and by and large know what it is, just by our normal powers of reason, irrespective of our religious beliefs. And where God figures into this thing is how He, which I have some more slides that I perhaps can get to later if we have that opportunity, but I'm going to go into answer these questions specifically. So, proximately, no, I don't think we need God to be good. Ultimately, I do think we need God to be good. Let me close with an analogy. This analogy takes the balance of my time. It's like, suppose somebody asks you, do we need God for gravity? You know, or the equivalent in the analogy to, you know, can we be moral without God? Can we be heavy without God? Well, what we don't mean is, we're not asking, hopefully, the question, well, gee, if you're an agnostic or an atheist, then you might have to be careful because you might start floating around. Because if you don't understand God and gravity, then that's not what we mean. Because we realize, look, gravity is just part of reality. It doesn't matter what you believe about reality with respect to gravity being able to have its effect on you. So, proximately, you don't need God in order to account for gravity because you experience that more certainly than you experience God perhaps in your life. But I would argue ultimately you do, because as the Creator God, He's the only explanation for why there's gravity, not whether there's gravity. So I think there's an analogy here to the good that hopefully during the Q&A we can explore. Now my model is known as natural law theory. And so Dr. Beshears has written a book. I assume that's on the back table? Okay, I think that's for sale. Dr. Beshears has written a book on natural law where he tries to summarize what that is. And let me just see if I can take a minute to tell you what I want you to know about it. Natural law theory, which by the way is part of our heritage as Americans. If you read the Declaration of Independence, when the course of independence becomes necessary for one people to sever the political lines which connect with another, and assuming among the powers of the earth are separate but equal station in which the laws of nature and nature God entitle them at least to respect for the opinions of mankind require that they should give a reason which impel them to the separation. And then the part we have memorized, with all these truths to be self-evident and all men created equal, and that they're endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. But think what was said just before that. Decent respect for the opinions of mankind require that they should give an opinion which impelled them to separate. Because the laws of nature and nature's God impelled the founding fathers to be able to sever our relationship with King George. What was that all a reference to? Have I got 1 minute? It was a reference to the fact that there was a core morality that was knowable by reason, by human beings, by reason, just like the laws of science could be known, irrespective of your religious convictions, whether there was or wasn't a God. But as I hope will come out, I do think there is that connection. It's just not at the front end, where I think a lot of Christians are getting used to thinking that just immediately the implications of morality is immediately there must be God. I think it's a little bit more teased out than that. So hopefully we'll be able to do that here in due course. Thank you. John's a tech guy.
I don't think I'm on.
You are.
Yes.
Hello? Hello? Okay. All right.
respond to Dr. Howe?
No.
May I pose a couple of questions and then just kind of turn it over to the two of you for...
I'm probably going to turn whatever you say into answering him.
No matter what you ask him, he's going to go, that's a good question. Let me first of all start out with.
Actually, I assume that. What I'd like to know, Dr. Fein and Dr. Howe, is what do you see as the fundamental difference between the two of you as far as your philosophy of life is concerned?
We got big differences. Although, you know, a lot of our conclusions in the end come out the same. We get there very, very differently. First of all, I do not believe we need God in order to be moral. I consider myself an enormously moral person.
I agree.
I do not believe I need God at all. And, oh, by the way, I don't believe in natural law either. Where do you find it? Do you look under a rock and find it there? Somehow people look and they find different laws. Go and ask ISIS. They are very religious people. Our president doesn't think that they're Islamic, but they are. They are deeply Islamic in a medieval kind of a way. In other words, they would disagree with you dramatically as to what the laws of God say. Okay, and you find that throughout history, including within Christianity, which is why I went looking empirically. What do we do? Okay, and I concluded that you say look for the answer and you're going to get it through reason, and I concluded no, you're not going to get it through reason at all. There have been a lot of theories about how you get it through reason, and remember I said I think that moral rules are informal. I think that they are polarized in their negotiations, and I think that they're emotional. None of those things are reason. None of them. And there was a good example. Here's one. You know, by the way, does anybody know what the first commandment is of the 10 Commandments? Are you aware that there are actually two first commandments? When I first did my book on morality, I looked up my desk encyclopedia under the 10 Commandments, assuming that would be a good place to start looking for what morality is. And I can almost quote the first line, the 10 Commandments of which there are 12. And I went, what? And it turns out that, yeah, because it turns out that people, different religions, look at exactly the same words in the Bible, and they count them differently. The first commandment is, thou shalt have no other God before me. But some people say the next part, and thou shalt not make graven images, is part of one. Other people say, no, that's number 2. But then you're not supposed to have graven images. What does that mean? I hope you know that the Jews and Catholics and Congregationalists and Muslims and Greek Orthodox all come to different conclusions, reading exactly the same words. Okay? You go to a Jewish synagogue, you will find no pictures. You'll find the 10 Commandments, but you will find no statues, nothing of the sort you're going to find in a Catholic church or an Episcopal church. But you go to the Congregational church, there you're going to have the 10 Commandments. You're going to have a cross. You're not going to have a crucifix. No Jesus on the cross. Okay? You go to an Islamic temple, you're going to find calligraphy, words from the Quran, no pictures whatsoever. You go to a Greek Orthodox church, and what are you going to find? Icons. They fought a war over this thing. And they came to the conclusion you can have pictures as long as they're not realistic. So I say, wait a minute now. Here is supposedly a law from God, and people come to different conclusions as to what it means. How do you get that from reason?
Thank you, Dr. Howe.
Yes. Well, of course, when you get to Jesus, then the commandments get down to 2. Love your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. Well, I was interested in his comments because your question was what was the difference between us? Fundamental difference. And I think that he thinks that what he just said was part of the fundamental difference between us, which I don't think that it is. because I wasn't espousing a concept of law in terms of rules, like 10 Commandments or these kind of things that were supposed to go out under some rock to find. And that may be the fault of how natural law theory has been sculpted since Locke, let's say. You would be probably more of an expert at this than I, in terms of its more recent instantiations. But natural law has to do with the fact, first of all, the word natural in natural law is not natural law like gravity necessarily or electromagnetism. It stems from the fact, the commitment of the fact that as human beings, we have natures. That is, we are essences, are things. And that what we are as a human being is because of an essence that we possess, as opposed to a function that we might have. So, for example, suppose you're sitting in your house, you're eating breakfast, you're eating your Honey Nut Cheerios, okay? And so somebody comes up to you and says, well, you're eating your Honey Nut Cheerios with a false spoon, okay? First thing you're going to go is, what are you doing in my house at breakfast? Okay? That'd be the first thing. I'm not even dressed yet, okay? I got my bathrobe on. But it's not that you would disagree and just go to the mat trying to defend the fact that the spoon you have is a true spoon and these kind of things. You would realize the idea of true and false with respect to a function is incoherent. Spoons are just things that spoon. That's all it is to be a spoon, right? It just is what it does. I would submit to you that being a human being isn't merely we just are what we do. But rather, it's the other way around. We do because of what we are. What the theologians would call a soul, what Aristotle would have called the form. Plato might have used the idea similar to Aristotle. Certainly Thomas Aquinas picks up on this. And so the idea is, if we are definable things called humans, then what is good for us will arise out of what our nature is. One other illustration. We use the words good and bad in broader context than we use the words good and bad in a moral context. And I would submit to your consideration that moral good and bad is a subset of a broader concept of what good and bad or good and evil are. That not all good and evil are moral goods and evils. And we use the language this way all the time. If somebody hands you a knife and they go, this is a pretty bad knife. Well, what makes a knife a bad knife? Well, it's got a dull blade. Well, why having a dull blade, why is that bad for a knife? It's actually good for a spoon to be dull, because you don't want to eviscerate your tongue. I guess you can't eviscerate your tongue, but you don't want to slice your tongue all up with a spoon, right? So why is the knife being dull bad for the knife?
Socially constructed with the offender.
I will give you a succinct example if I can, okay? 300 years ago, Catholics and Protestants were killing each other over such things as the meaning of transubstantiation. Both sides thought they were absolutely right and they were going to have their view succeed. Neither group won. And what came out of this social negotiation that involved warfare and a lot more was a new idea: tolerance. And tolerance is now something that Western societies hold near and dear. Our ancestors 400 years ago would have laughed at the idea.
All right, and Dr. Howe, obviously as a Christian, you do believe there's an absolute and universal standard for right and wrong. And so what is your understanding of where we get our concepts of right and wrong?
I think the example Dr. Fein uses is probably familiar to many who study Christian apologetics, that C.S. Lewis makes quite a bit out of in his Mere Christianity, that in light of people's accusations that, well, morality, for example, is relative because all of these various cultures have different rights and wrongs, Lewis pointed out, I think rightfully, and Dr. Fein pointed out as well, that, well, no, it's not that murder, for example, is ever right in any society. It's just that societies may differ as to what they consider to be murder. And you could use examples of indecency. No society advocates indecency, but societies may differ as to what they consider to be public decency or not. So Lewis argues from that there is this sort of core morality that characterizes the human experience. In fact, there's a parallel in world religions, because I used to hear a lot as a younger Christian when you try to talk religion with people and say, well, I think all religions are basically the same at the core, they just differ on the details. And it's actually the exact opposite. If you look at all the world's religions, at least the ones that I'm familiar with as a professor of world religions, and many of the world's philosophies, you find that in the periphery, in the details, that's where they're all alike. Don't murder, honor your parents, respect your elders, nurture the children, don't lie. You find this universal in world's religions and many of the world's philosophy. Where you find their differences are in the core. Is there a God? Who is Jesus? Did he rise from the dead? Is he the Son of God? What about Krishna? Whatever, however many questions you want to add. The defining things of these religions. So I see a parallel between the religions and the morality. Now, just one quick thing about this idea of absoluteness. Because remember, I would argue that morality is a subset of the question of good and evil. So good and evil don't always just mean moral good and evil. So what we have to ask is, well then, if good is some words that people use that I hesitate to use them, but for lack of a better one at the moment, and then I can qualify it if I need to, is the concept of human flourishing. That's what is good for a human, is to flourish. But when we start asking questions about, well, first of all, do I have the moral resolve? I think our problems as human beings is not so much not knowing what's good or evil. It's the inability to do what we already know to be the good. That I find myself not able to perform what I already know to be good. So where I see God coming in, you didn't ask me this, but it was sort of hitchhiking on our original. God is there, among other things, to give us this power within to be able to begin to follow the dictates of morality that we sometimes find ourselves impossible, or at least less than capable many times of following. So I do believe in absolute morality, but it only stems from the fact that we're created by God to be a certain kind of thing, and that morality arises out of what contributes to that flourishing of us as God's creatures.
Dr. Fein, what's your fundamental criticism or point of departure from Dr. Howe's?
My first 15 minutes, I think that was the point of departure.
Dr. Howe talks about the essence of human beings. That's, to me, an extraordinarily vague concept. So is a concept like flourishing. Very vague. These are elastic concepts that you can make fit whatever you want them to fit. I don't look for an essence of human beings. I look for the complexity in human beings, and there are many aspects. I look for how do we create hierarchies? What impulses do we have that move us in that direction? Or I look to understand how does anger work, or how does guilt work, or when I'm talking about morality and so forth. Or I'm interested in love, and what is love, and how, which is apparently related to something called attachment behavior. And it's something that you can study, and you can find out that many of the aspects, many of the mechanisms we use to enforce morality are actually parallel in many cases with animals that, believe it or not, have rules too. Obviously not in words like we do, but they enforce certain behavior patterns, and it will vary from animal to animal. So my world is much more complex and much less precise, and I am constantly looking. I am always, once I answer one question, up pop 2 or 3 additional ones that I'm going to study.
Dr. Howe, what would be your fundamental criticism or critique of Dr. Fein's position? And don't be complex.
Well, I found it interesting that it sounded like his accusation that my appealing to human essence and things was vague, as if that was an indictment. But then he ends up celebrating the fact that his world is much more complex than mine. So I thought, well, is it more complex because they're less vague? That doesn't seem to make sense to me. But besides that, I don't think it's as elusive. Let me say it this way. I'm not a skeptic, and I don't think Dr. Fein is a skeptic. So while it might be interesting and it might be relevant to a certain extent that there are conflicting views about X, I don't take the fact that there are conflicting views as a cue to just retire my effort to try to understand X and then come to the point, and I know he's not this way. come to the point where I would just go, well, I'm not going to have the temerity to say you're wrong about X. Okay, fine. There are different views about human essence or whatever. That's fine. I think some of them are wrong. That's all. And I would try to defend my view of human essence. And by the way, it's not, this doesn't make it true, but it's not that particularly elusive in as much as it's a conversation that's been going on for about 2,500 years in Western thought. So we go back to Aristotle and start exploring questions about what is a human being? So I'm not a skeptic about these things.
Are we comfortable now in just transitioning to an open Q&A with the audience? Okay, very good. And I'd like to ask Bruce to come forward and sort of usher in.
Hey, don't be an idiot and not turn your mic on.
Now, who would do that?
God, what kind of chump would do that, right?
See, normally I'm only tasked with control of the audience. Now I have the audience and the speakers. A few pieces of housekeeping in the first place. Jeffrey did not mention that we are a 501c3 organization, which is a not-for-profit organization, but we strive mightily to be a not-for-loss organization. And so if you would be interested in contributing to us to help us defray the costs that we have for these kinds of events, I'd appreciate a lot. Have friends pass a bucket around to make sure it goes to the end. Now, Jeffrey, I need a word from you. If people ask questions, should they direct them directly to one or the other, or should both people have a chance to respond to every question, or what would you like to do?
I assume both of you should have a shot.
Have a shot at each of the questions. Okay.
If we could just make it as succinct as possible.
That's fine. Now, the other thing is this is being recorded, and one of the most annoying things in the world is when you're watching the subsequent recording and a question comes up and you can't hear it. So if you'd like to ask a question, just give me a show of hands. I will take the mic to you and let you ask that question that way. But please give it back to me so I can be prepared to get to the next person. Okay, does that make sense?
Wait, now, go back. Could you repeat that? Yes. We don't have time for questions now because the instructions are...
Let's start over here, Bob.
This is a very simple question. I'm 71 years old. It seems like just a few years ago that I was a teenager. And I don't have as many years ahead of me as I have behind me. Life is short. You don't realize it until you get older. And I want to just believe God be good and what is good. But why be good? Why not? If life is short and there's no afterlife, possibly, you say, why would you not just serve everything that made you personally content and happy, regardless of whether anybody else profited from it, regardless of whether there's another generation after you or whatever? Just do anything and everything you can to be as content and happy and as fulfilled as you personally, selfishly can. The question is, why?
Shall I answer that? Now, young man, because I'm older than you, thank you. My grandfather was an out-and-out atheist. And I was told as a young man, nobody dies an atheist. Well, he did. He lived a pretty decent life. He was a decent human being. I was taught to be a decent human being. I believe in being a decent human being. Part of it comes from who we are as human beings, not necessarily in essence, but for example, I love my wife and I don't want bad things to happen to her. You see, you're assuming that the essence of human beings is selfishness and only selfishness. Well, selfishness is part of who we are, but it's not all that we are, okay? And so, yeah, I do worry about other people, and I do worry about other generations. And part of who I am comes from my genetic legacy, and part comes from my legacy having grown up in this society, in my family, in my community. You know, I've been abundantly plain. I'm not a religious man, but I've certainly been influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition. I've certainly learned it, okay? And certainly internalized much of it. I do it because I care. I don't give a damn what everyone else cares about. I care. And so I'm going to die Sadly, my mother just died last week, so I'm very aware of death. I am going to die such that I can go respecting myself, feeling good about who I am as a human being. And that will not happen if I go through this life simply gimme, 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 gimme. It's not the way.
Yeah, let me respond if I may, because I want to make sure I'm clear that nothing I've said tonight should be taken to mean that I thought that because someone like a Dr. Fein is an agnostic that they couldn't be a decent human being. In fact, I've been arguing the exact opposite. Where I take your question to be rooted in is I think these people that live these despicable kind of lives are living a life that they wrongly perceive is their own flourishing. So the question becomes, what is human flourishing, objectively speaking? Not just what provides me individual personal satisfaction in any kind of facile interpretation of satisfaction, but what really is my flourishing? There are two things that I think are relevant to this, to the discussion about it. One is the history of ideas that we've been having this conversation as Westerners for 2.5 millennia. Has there been any informed voices that seem to can help us understand what is the good life? And I think there's been much inroads made into that in the history of Western thought. And I'm just confining it to Western thought because that's the predominance of my own training. But the other part that I think cannot fail to be factored in is to whatever extent we rightfully should be concerned about our flourishing in this life. One of the rhetorical questions I would like to ask Dr. Fein is, if there is a God, and if there is an afterlife, would that make any difference? That if you live in this life 80, 90, 100 years, but you live, I'm just saying if, but you live the next life for all eternity, then does it matter whether or not what you do in this life has a bearing on the quality of flourishing in the next life? And I think that's the obvious answer is yes, if. The question then, well, is there a God? Is there an afterlife? Those are fair questions to ask. I'm just asking something weaker. If that was the case, would it matter? In order to bring up the questions to say, see, this does matter. These aren't just academic questions, any more than questions on this side of the grave are academic when we begin to ponder, what is a good human being? What is a good life? And go, good, I'm happy about that. But I also think we have to factor in, what about the next life? And what is a good human being in the next life? I realize those are cosmic questions, but anyway, yes, Mr. Phillips.
One back to the back.
If morality is, at least in part, a social construct, do we ever have the right to call another culture or society wrong, and if so, when?
The answer to that is absolutely yes, and we have and we do. I like to use the example of the sati. When the British came and took over India, the Indians' custom was the sati, in which when a promised man died and he was burnt on the funeral pyre, his wife was obliged to jump into the pyre herself and kill herself. And the British viceroy forbade it. He said, you can't do this, this is murder. And the Indian magnates went to him and said, but sir, this is our custom. We follow this because this is our belief. And he said, very well, that is your custom, that is your belief, you may follow it, but I will follow my custom. And my custom is, when you kill somebody, we kill you. And you know what? There's no sati in India anymore. Same thing with cannibalism in New Guinea. This creation of moral rules is not something necessarily within a society. It can be between societies too. Societies do, in fact, influence one another. And as Western society has expanded around the world, it has modified the moral beliefs of countless billions of people. And I don't see anything wrong with that at all. That's also part of the way this works.
I've noticed at least 3 times that Dr. Fein has appealed either explicitly or implicitly to absolutes to make he's actually used the word absolutely. This is not right to do more than once, and I celebrate that because I think earlier he explicitly denied that he thought there were these absolutes. So I take the question to be not just is it just in fact possible, or I should say, not is it just in fact actual that some cultures have been able to trump other cultures in terms of their rights and wrongs. Yeah, that's just an observation that yes, we've been able to do this. The question is a deeper one in terms of, well, what if there is something right about this, is it objectively right that's transcultural? And I think the question has to be answered in the affirmative. Otherwise, we're just left with moral skepticism, which neither of us are. So to reverse engineer it, we go, we know there are objective rights and wrongs. We know that these practices were wrong for the wife to be obligated to kill herself on the funeral pyre of her husband. We know that cannibalism is wrong. It's not whether they're wrong. I'm just asking the questions, well, how do we sort of reverse engineer to say, what kind of world and reality is there that accounts for the fact that we already know these things are wrong? Another thing that's relevant to this thing, not only in the issues of afterlife, but also one of the things that I would have brought up if I had 2 hours to do my PowerPoint, is that if there is a God and we answer in the affirmative that God has revealed himself to human beings, then might it be that there's additional data out there with respect to moral obligations? And we learn from the teachings of Jesus, it's not just enough to refrain from committing adultery. There's also something to be said about having lust. It's not just enough to refrain from murder. There's also something moral about anger, illicit anger. If that's true, then that makes this whole questions of morality much more interesting and hitting a whole lot closer to home, because now it's easy for me not to murder. It's a lot harder for me not to hate people without a cause.
All right, here to say, Richard, why don't you start with this one and then find the following.
Okay. What is it like to be a Jew? That's the question I get. Sorry, I can't answer that.
The question we're being discussing is, can you have good without God? The answer is that the Bible says that the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge, and fool despises wisdom in himself. And God says to the children of Israel, come to reason with me. Your sins are as sharp as these white as snow. So God says that He's reaching down to man to explain to him what morality is. There's no morality apart from God. There's no knowledge apart from God. Man, there's no God.
All right, let me see if I want to weigh in on that, and I want to hear what Dr. Fein has to say. Because as my analogy from gravity tried to show, if you ask, well, is there any gravity without God? Well, no, not in the ultimate sense, because God is the creator. But if you mean, is there any gravity without God? If you mean by that, well, do atheists float around and only the Christians? Well, no, I don't mean that. Because gravity is real. Now, so ultimately we account, this is what I would argue, ultimately we account for the existence of gravity because of God as creator. But the experience of gravity is just by virtue of being a human being. And I think there's an analogy to morality. There's no ultimate morality without God having created us in His image. I agree with that. But there's proximate morality in this sense, that this gentleman certainly knows what a decent human being is to a greater extent than a lot of people I know, in academics especially. And he certainly knows what it means to love his family, for example. So we're not saying, well, if you're not a Christian, what do you know about loving your wife? Well, he may know more about loving his wife than many Christians I know. That's not the dispute. Where the dispute ought to be these ultimate questions, I think, and then these practical questions in terms of, well, then if there is a God, can He help me be the kind of human being He's created me to be? In terms of internal moral power, that practical question of living the moral life, and then the ultimate cosmic questions of what is the ultimate accounting for it all. Yes, sir.
All right. As an empiricist, among other things that I have read about and studied in my deeper studies is the origin of the Bible itself. Wonderful book of who wrote the Bible. It's amazing how much is learned about that. Because the Bible, you may not know, is written with contradictions, literal contradictions, because it was written by different people at different times. I think that's fairly well established among scholars nowadays.
Well, go ahead. I wanted to make sure he had his chance to.
I want to respond to this. As for what happens when you die, you folks may be familiar with Pascal's wager. Pascal said, look, we can't be assured whether there's a God or there isn't a God, but you might as well bet that there is, because if there is one, when you get there, you know, you'll be welcomed into heaven. And my response to that is, if God is the kind of God who will bring you to heaven only if you decide to fool him into thinking you believe in him, then I don't know if I want to hang around with him. Okay? I have my principles. I have very strong principles. And this may sound arrogant, but I expect God to live up to those principles. I am an honest man. I really strive to be an honest man. And I hope if there's a God that he respects somebody who's honest. Okay? Because if there's a God who doesn't believe in honesty, I'm not changing my views. I still believe in it. I don't know if there's an afterlife, if there's not an afterlife. I have no idea what it will be like or what it won't be like or whatnot. I know this life. And I am going to live the best life I can. The philosopher Sidney Hook was asked, what if you die and you stand before God and God says, how come you didn't believe in me? Sidney Hook's answer was, you didn't give me enough evidence. I don't have enough evidence to conclude that there is a God. There might be a God, but I don't see the evidence, and I am going to be honest with myself. Okay? And I'm not going to, fiddle around with words and pretend and what have you. I am an honest agnostic in the sense that I really don't know. And I'm just not going to pretend I do. Not to make anybody happy, because I have to be happy with myself.
Back to you, Dr. Fein, can you start with this one?
Is it morally admirable to have mercy on an individual who, say, will never progress mentally past the age of 8 or 12 and can never contribute to society in any meaningful way, and if so, why?
You know, I actually did work with retarded clients. They weren't my specialty, but I worked with them, including profoundly retarded, who couldn't even feed themselves, who had to wear diapers, the whole shit, okay? And I was actually very unhappy that people treated these folks like performing animals. They taught them various tricks to make the parents feel good that their kids weren't as limited as they were. And my attitude was, let me make them happy. They do have feelings. I did work one summer with autistic kids. And it was, you know, and in the beginning I thought I was going to do all kinds of things, and after a week or two I realized, no, nothing's going to happen. And so I strove to just give them a good summer. And I was lucky I had a fellow counselor who came from Denmark who brought his guitar with him, and he would sing lullabies at night, and I would duck them in, and what have you. And I see nothing wrong with making people who are not intelligent happy. I'm going to be immodest here. I am a very bright person. I'm not going to beat around the bush. But being smart doesn't necessarily make me a better person, any more than somebody being tall or beautiful or whatever it is. We have these various qualities, okay? And I think we can all be appreciated for our different qualities. Just be honest about this thing, okay? And I've got to tell you, there are lots of smart people in this world who I loathe.
Does that have anything to do with Kennesaw State University? Never mind, don't answer.
I have a few colleagues whom I would drown if I could.
Well, let me weigh in on that, because this is where, at least one place where vividly the cash value, if you will, of my earlier distinction between essence and function comes in. Because people that are severely retarded, or even more so in terms of volatile issues in our culture, people who are pre-born, or people at end of life who are in dementia or whatever, if you have a functional view of human nature, then as soon as or whenever someone doesn't seemingly function like a human being ought to, they seem to be rendered less valuable. So that's why as a culture now we don't think twice about killing the unborn, because after all they don't have a sense of self-awareness, they don't have a sense of projection of the future, and they can't have a sense of moral consciousness. All these functional criteria that we insist the fetus have in order to conclude it's a human. And now we're doing similar things at the other end with euthanasia. Whereas I think our heritage we ought to stick to what is, this doesn't make it true because it's our heritage, but it is, that we understand human beings to be certain kinds of things. They're kinds of things. And so they are a human because of what they are, not they are human because of what they do. So a quick illustration. If you see the metal fragments and particles, let's say down in a mine, embedded in the clay, they're mining this metal. Do they mine metal? I just made that up. Okay. Just work with me here. How ludicrous would it be for somebody to look down at those metal fragments and go, there's a spoon down there, to go back to my earlier analogy. There's a spoon there. What do you mean? There's a spoon right there. And people go, that's crazy, because that metal isn't a spoon until it goes through a certain process of development and then can function like a spoon. You can spoon your cereal to your mouth. Then it's a spoon. But yet, and I go, okay, that makes sense, because we do have functional definitions of spoons. That's right. But when you have a functional understanding of human beings, that's why people can look at a fetus in the womb and not recognize that it's a human. Or to say it more practically, that's why when we as pro-lifers point at the unborn and say that's a human, to a lot of people we sound like the guy pointing to the metal fragment saying that's a spoon. That's what we sound like. Why? Because they have been, for whatever reason, inculcated to think that human beings are just a certain thing that functions a certain way. And we've got to, I think, work on that as a culture to get people to realize, no, to be a human being is to have a human nature, a human essence, whatever else you want to call it, the soul or whatever. Anyway. Next question. We're already done.
Okay. Oh, suddenly there's three. My goodness. So, we're going to go to 9 o'clock here. We go to 5 after?
Yeah, about 7 more minutes.
You notice the plate up here on the stage is just totally empty. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I meant. Dr. Fein and I did not help a whole lot with the offering plate.
My question is to Dr. Howe.
I guess we're going to get the comment. But
I'm not asking this question to be cynical or challenging the comment. I'm asking this question because you're a very transparent person. You said I'm an honest person. If anybody asks me that question, I cannot say I'm an honest person with confidence because I'm not honest to all the time with everybody. Sometimes I'm too fair. So if someone asks me, are you an honest person? I'll say, I try to be, but I'm not an honest person. When you say that I'm an honest person, what makes you say you're an honest person? That level of confidence, what is your reference point of being honest?
You're asking Dr. Fein.
Yeah. I am, if anything, too damn honest. I'm honest enough to say that I'm not always honest. No. There are times when saying you're honest, saying this, the truth is going to get you in trouble, going to get other people in trouble, in which case I generally keep my mouth shut. If I lie by omission. I let people think things that are not true, if I think that it's important for other circumstances. But I will, listen, let me tell you, I am not politically correct. Let me tell you, standing up in front of a bunch of college students most of whom are liberals, and saying, I think feminism is wrong. That takes some guts. Okay? Okay? I do that, and I do that. I used to think of myself as a coward because my father beat me and I was a frightened little boy. And I have gradually learned to develop my courage and to stand up for what I believe is right. And when I tell people nowadays that I thought of myself as a coward, they laugh at me. Because I will say what I think is true to anybody. I will say it to huge audiences of people who disagree with me. If you read my columns, when Mary in a journal, you're going to find out, especially if you read it online and see what people say, you're going to see there are people in this world who hate my guts because I say things that they don't think are true. I think they're true. Mind you, I understand that I make mistakes. Who doesn't make mistakes? But I'm trying to get it right. And I will tell you what I think is right, assuming the circumstances allow. If the circumstances don't allow, I won't say. If you don't think that this is true, go to KSU and ask some of my colleagues or my students about whether Dr. Fein is honest or not. Go online on the Pick-a-Prof and see what they say about me. I am an honest man, okay? And I pride myself on it.
Well, this time I'm not lying. No, I mean, I don't know if it's right for me to comment on his autobiography, but he certainly is an honest man. I take your question to be, again, back to this idea of the standard. I think at the approximate level, the standard is just like the standard of a good knife is to have what a knife ought to have by virtue of being a knife. This is an analogy, including a sharp blade. Even though my brother's email signature is, we sell bladeless knives without handles. Think about that for a second. So, a knife ought to have a sharp blade. Why? Because it's a knife. Human beings ought to be a certain way and act a certain way. Why? Because they're human beings. That's what it is to be a good human. What I think is needed here, because I appreciated what Dr. Fein said in the previous exchange when he said about his agnosticism. And I'm over here salivating going, yeah, that would be a great thing to have an encore. Maybe nobody will show up for it. It's just, let's talk about what is this evidence. I think Sidney Hook, I don't know what Sidney Hook read. I know that famous line from his because there wasn't enough evidence. But I mean, I know people that think there's not enough evidence that women are equal to men. That they think women ought to be subjugated. But I'm not impressed with the fact that there are people that think that about women. I just think that they're ingrates, moral ingrates, for thinking that. And I'd like to be able to leverage an argument as to why men and women are equal as human beings, especially before God. So, Sidney Hook, with all due respect, I would say, well, give me a chance to marshal some of this evidence and see, especially if we think it matters. The last quick thing is that, I try to be honest. I'm not necessarily always transparent, but I try to be honest. And I fail at it, like I think we would all pick any moral thing. I think we'd all say to some degree or another that we fail at it. That's why I brought up the idea that there's more to this whole challenge before us than just deciding what we think it is to be a good human being. Because I think a lot of times the problems we have isn't knowing what we ought to do. It's finding the fortitude morally within us to do what we already know to do. And that is another area where I think God ties into this, in terms of giving us power to live a moral life.
One last one, unless I ask a final question.
Okay.
My question is for Dr. Fein, but Dr. Howe, you queued it up really nicely. Earlier you said, Dr. Fein, that you don't have enough evidence to believe in God. So, Sidney Hook aside, what would it require for you to be convinced of a God?
Have to come down and talk to me. No, I'd have to see him. I'd have to, it's sort of like, where are you, guy? Haven't talked to me yet. No burning bushes, no nothing. All the evidence.
I know about 30-something Christians that just decided that their prayers are going to be answered. I'm just saying.
Listen, it's like, what did I say? I'm an empiricist, I'm a scientist. I look for data, I look for evidence, I look for everywhere. And I try to be honest about that too. Sadly, in sociology, there's a lot of playing games nowadays. People do research to prove what they already believe. And that bothers me no end. And I hope there are postmodernists who say there's no such thing as truth. I think that's utterly ridiculous. Of course there are truths. Some truths are easy. There's a microphone on stage right now. This is true, okay? That's easy. But other things are hard. Figuring out what the best way to live, that's very hard, okay? And so I try to make a difference between what I know a little bit, what I don't know at all.
Several times Dr. Fein has commented, self-described as an empiricist, and I think I understand what he means by that. I'm an empiricist as well. But what I think a lot of people, not necessarily Dr. Fein, but what I think a lot of people don't understand about empiricism is there's a big, big difference between modern, contemporary empiricism and classical empiricism. And a lot of people would be surprised to know that Aristotle is an empiricist. He doesn't preempt conclusions about non-physical reality, like logical truths, moral truths, and theological truths in God. In fact, it completely resonates with this robust empiricism that characterized Western thought until about the 17th century. That doesn't make it true. I'm not saying, well, gee, most of the time we were a different kind of empiricism, but it does, I think, warrant an investigation on how could Aristotle be an empiricist and conclude all the things he concluded about morality, metaphysics, logic, mathematics, and God, and then Richard Dawkins be just as enthusiastic an empiricist and think that things like God and these abstract things are just silly and false. How could that happen? How that happens, how we go from one to the other, is a dramatic story, I think, in the history of ideas that I think warrant further investigation.
I think we've arrived at the end of our allotted time. Let's show our appreciation to our